Good afternoon and welcome to Broadband Breakfast Live Online for the first Broadband Breakfast Live Online of the new year. Happy New Year, everyone. It's January 3rd, 2024. We're still kind of celebrating the holiday season a little bit, so I'll put my elf hat back on. I'm Drew Clark, editor and publisher of Broadband Breakfast, and I am so excited to be joined today by four other journalists who bring an incredible depth of knowledge and understanding to the issues of broadband and technology. And so I'm very excited to introduce them just now. But before we do that, I'm really pleased to be able to share a couple of updates from Broadband Breakfast side. First off, and I know this is a bit of a tease, but we are going to be relaunching Broadband Breakfast with a new website in a matter of weeks this month, and very, very excited for it and for hopefully making the experience a lot easier for all of our members and users and visitors. We will be continuing with Broadband Breakfast Live Online every Wednesday, this free event. We're excited to be able to do this event, and kind of our hope and goal is that it helps to bring the broadband community together. We would not be able to do this weekly event without the support of our sponsors that include Utopia Fiber, Broadband.money, Comcast, Wesco, Coup Systems, Community Broadband Networks Initiative of the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, the California Emerging Technology Fund, DCS Technologies, Nokia, Broadband Toolkit, Google Fiber, Broadband Now, and Michael Baker International. Thank you to our sponsors that allow us to do this program every week. We are planning to do a couple of exciting events in future weeks. For example, next week, Broadband Breakfast reporter Jake Neenan will be live from the CES, formerly the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas. He'll be reporting, and we'll be talking with other panelists who are out in Las Vegas at CES 2024. And coming up the next week, we're going to be kind of doing a little bit offbeat topic, but I'm excited. I've been excited for it for a while. We're going to talk about broadband in the global south, using India, Australia, and South Africa as examples, each of which have done interesting stuff with broadband and broadband deployment in recent years. And then on the 24th of January, we'll be kind of returning to broadband mapping and the BEAD challenge process. And that's in preparation for our upcoming in-person conference on February 8th, the Broadband Mapping Summit. Stay tuned for more information about that. The other thing, and this is something that's concluding today, so hopefully you've had a chance to see this, and if you haven't, please, by all means, check these out. I'm going to share my screen just briefly for everyone to be able to see this here. This is our 12 days of broadband, and excited that we did all 12 of these. Really kudos to the reporters on our team, Jake Neenan and Jericho Casper. I contributed too, editor Ahmed Hattout, all pitched in. This is the last one, and so in order to kind of give the spirit of the 12 days, I do have to, hopefully not sing, but on the 12th day of broadband, or I should say on the first day of broadband, my true love sent to me one artificial general intelligence. On the second day of broadband, 24 reverse preemption poll attachment states. 2023 edition, to clarify, because we did a similar topic on this last year, but there was a lot of news on it in 2023. On this third day of broadband, 3.6 billion funds remaining in the Affordable Connectivity Program. On the fourth day of broadband, 4.8 million challenges to broadband coverage data. On the fifth day of broadband, 56 states and territorial broadband offices implementing BEAD, the Broadband Equity, Access, and Deployment Program. On the sixth day of broadband, $166 billion in American semiconductor investment. On the seventh day of broadband, 7 layers to the open systems interconnection model and open access networks. On the 8th day of broadband, and this was a really hard one, the number 8 is a representation of balance, justice, and fairness, and that was about digital discrimination. On the 8th day of well, I just did that. On the 9th day of broadband, 93% match of federal funds for enabling middle mile broadband programs. On the 10th day of broadband, 10 months without FCC spectrum authority. On the 11th day of broadband, more than 11 years in lawsuits over net neutrality. And on the 12th day of broadband today, 12 years old or older, 12-year-olds and older having to age verify on social media. So all these stories are available on Broadband Breakfast. Just click on the 12 days of broadband. You can see the illustrations. And by the way, all these illustrations were done by DALL-E. So kudos to DALL-E for that. It took me a lot of work to kind of teach DALL-E what I wanted, but anyway, these were all kind of inspired and done by DALL-E based on the topics at hand. So those are our 12 days of broadband. Thanks for indulging me. That's what we viewed as the 12, seriously now, right? The 12 most important topics that we cover at Broadband Breakfast. We're going to be talking now with 4 other technology and broadband journalists who may have different takes, may see different stories, may have different attitudes about the top 10 or 12 or 3 or 5 stories of 2023 and what they expect is going to be significant and new in the new year. So let me introduce them. I will introduce them in the order that they're going to speak. We're going to hear first from Ted Hearn, who's editor and publisher of Policyband, a new website dedicated to comprehensive coverage of the broadband communications market. He's a former communications executive and reporter for newsletters and trade journals. And I've known Ted for many years and really excited to see him doing something that is exciting. I mean, what else can you say, Ted? You're smiling, and I look forward to hearing from you and what you're up to. So following Ted, we're going to hear from Howard Buskirk. Howard is executive senior editor and joined at Warren Communications News, Communications Daily, as everyone knows it, or Com Daily, right? And Howard covers a lot. I'm sure he'll explain more, but he's also covered Capitol Hill for Telecommunications Reports previously, and has also worked in Energy Business Watch, as well as Gas Daily and Natural Gas Week. So, and as well as Atlanta Journal-Constitution and Greenville News. So, got a really deep journalism background. Howard, I'm glad we could finally get you on a Broadband Breakfast Live Online. Thanks for being with us. Following Howard, we're going to hear from Sean Gonsalves. He's senior reporter, editor, and communications team lead at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance's Community Broadband Network Initiative. I mean, I can't speak too highly of what the Community Broadband Network Initiative does, and Sean is so instrumental to that team. You know, sometimes other people kind of bucket them in one way or put them in a like advocacy, but I view them as journalists. They do great reporting, really, really solid reporting about municipal networks, community networks, and how important they are. And we at Broadband Breakfast also kind of care deeply about that. So, Sean, I'm just so pleased that you could join us again. Repeat performance for you. Thank you for being with us and sharing your thoughts. And then batting cleanup will be Lynn Stanton. And Lynn, thank you for joining us and being with us here. Lynn is senior editor for Wolters Kluwer's TR Daily, or Telecommunications Reports Daily, and has been covering this field of telecom, broadband, internet policy for nearly 3 decades, and has also reported on pharmaceutical marketing and been a copy editor for a wide range of publications. Again, another journalist, so excited to have each of you. So with that, let's go ahead and turn the mic over to Ted. The floor is yours to tell us what you think the top broadband stories of 2023, what we should look for in 2024.
Drew, thanks a lot, and thank you for including me in this distinguished panel. Last week I wrote an article, and the headline was, for the cable industry, 2024 is going to be a chore. And by that I meant I think that 2024 is going to include a lot of litigation, and a lot of it generated by the cable TV industry. You're going to see lawsuits related to the FCC's orders on digital discrimination, net neutrality, early termination fees, and all-in pricing. That's 4. You could see a 5th related to retransmission consent blackout reporting, perhaps coupled with a requirement to provide consumers with rebates and those consumers who have been blacked out during retransmission consent disputes. And another possible case could arise if the FCC happens to move forward with the reclassification of or the classification of video streamers. Just going back to digital discrimination, in the section 60506 of the IIJA, Congress handed the FCC broad language. Normally, that is a good sign for the FCC when it has to defend rules in court. So I would expect that the FCC's digital discrimination rules will survive judicial review. How much of it? I couldn't really say, but probably a healthy percentage of it, 80, 90% of it. Some might get remanded, not sure. I will have to reconsider that position after the Supreme Court hands down a much anticipated ruling in a case called Loper Bright v. Raymundo. In that case, the Supreme Court is expected to overhaul the Chevron doctrine, and depending upon what the court says, assuming the court really tightens the Chevron doctrine, the FCC's digital discrimination rules might have a tougher time than I first imagined. Net neutrality. I think that the FCC's net neutrality rules are doomed. In 2022, the Supreme Court majority for the first time enunciated the major questions doctrine. And without getting into the weeds of the major questions doctrine, in a nutshell, it stands as a very high barrier to the FCC's imposition of Title II on broadband ISPs. So I think that cable and the other broadband ISPs are going to rely on the major questions doctrine to shut down the FCC on net neutrality. And it would not surprise me if the broadband ISPs are able to get a stay or injunction right away based on the major questions doctrine. The last thing I'll note is that, and I'm sure others will talk about this too, is on Capitol Hill, an early issue is going to be whether to extend the Affordable Connectivity Program. And right now, it looks like the issue is deadlocked. And if anything, there'll probably be a modest extension with some probably reduction in spending and some new safeguards. Well, that's my quick summary, and I'll hand it back to you, Drew. Thank you.
Thank you, Ted. Let's go next to Howard. Tell us what you saw and expect to see in 2024.
Okay, well, I was going to talk first about the FCC, and it seems like we're going to be into a very active period at the agency. There was a 2-2 divided FCC for a long time, and now you have a 3-2 Democratic majority without a lot of time, really, for the current chairwoman, Jessica Rosenworcel. The chairs tend to stay in place only for about 4 years. And so if she follows form, even if President Biden is reelected, she would probably be stepping down in not much more than another year. So I think we're going to see a very active FCC in a lot of areas. I was talking to someone this morning about what does that mean on the spectrum front, and because that's my big area of expertise. I'm sort of I guess the spectrum guy on this panel. I think they're going to be working on a lot of odds and ends, different little, like 4.9 gigahertz, for example. That's not a beat that comes to mind for people, or a spectrum band that comes to mind for people right away. But that's the kind of thing that you could see an order out on in the next month or two, maybe the February meeting, sort of finalizing the rules for that, which have been pending now for about a year. Under the last administration, it seemed like the goal of the FCC was to sort of not leave anything in the cupboard for the next administration in terms of spectrum, and they seem to do a pretty effective job of that. There were a lot of fights, and some of those fights continue, but they did get a lot of spectrum out. And yeah, I think the current FCC has been trying to just keep up and implement a lot of stuff, and it's been really difficult because of the expiration of spectrum authority, what is that? That's the 11 days.
10.
Or 10 days.
No, it's 10 days, more than 10 months.
More than 10 months, which is a long time. And that's a kind of thing I think a couple of years ago you wouldn't have seen coming, that the FCC would lose its spectrum authority and not be able to, because the auctions have been, everybody I think kind of agrees, been such a success story, but it's in the realm of weird politics right now, like everything is on Capitol Hill. So the outlook for that, I think, is a little bit unpredictable. The flip side is the carriers did get a lot of spectrum over the last couple of years between the 3.45 gigahertz and the C-band, and T-Mobile has all that 2.5 gigahertz spectrum. And I'm not really sure that carriers wouldn't be looking forward to another big auction right now anyway, because it would be really hard for them. It would probably create questions for them on Wall Street if they had to make another, $40-50 billion investment in spectrum right now. And they're still deploying what they have. So I think that while everybody wants to see the spectrum authority restored, and there's a lot of pressure right now to open up more mid-band spectrum, in particular for 5G and 6G. The carriers are also in a weird position in that they just spent a lot, and things are pretty tight. So I'm not really sure that anybody really wants a major auction this year or next year, and they're probably not going to get it anyway. And then one other thing that is really on my mind right now, just because as a daily journalist, I feel like you kind of go from day to day and like, what are you writing about today? And all the comments were coming in on the implementation of the national spectrum strategy. And so I think there's going to be a lot of comments in that basically about the importance of providing more mid-band for licensed use. But, on the other side, there's also a lot of interest in more spectrum sharing. And, and that's the other theme. That wasn't one of the days of Christmas, but spectrum sharing is definitely the big story in spectrum right now, because everything looks like it's going to be a shared band. Even something like 3.45, it's not a shared band exactly, but it came with a lot of protections for military use of the military radars. So we're into an era of spectrum sharing, and with things tighter and tighter and more spectrum in that's probably going to be one of the big spectrum stories. It has been and will be for the future is most of the spectrum that's going to come online is going to come with tight restrictions, or will be shared use. So I'm not sure how much of my
No, that's great. No, that's 5 minutes. So thank you. And yes, we did have a Broadband Breakfast Live online event about spectrum sharing. We just didn't make it one of the 12 days of broadband. So thank you for that observation.
There's always next year, Drew.
There always is.
Let's work on that one. Okay. So
all right, let's turn now to Sean. Give us your take on the top broadband stories of 2023 and looking forward to 2024.
Thanks for having me, Drew. First, congratulations on the new website. Haven't gone through that process last year. I know that can be a challenge. So congratulations on that. I mean, there's so many things. So it's an exciting time for broadband overall. Of course, BEAD and the Digital Equity Act, relatedly, are kind of the center of the broadband universe right now. As states, as you've reported, all 56 states and U.S. territories have submitted their, BEAD proposals, and Louisiana was the first state to get approval for its volume 2, which is sort of the final volume that you need before you can unlock those BEAD funds. So I sort of consider Louisiana to be, a canary in the coal mine, so to speak, in terms of what NTA will allow as a pathway forward for spending this unprecedented sum of federal infrastructure dollars on broadband. We're seeing, various states are taking different approaches, but something that I think is important to recognize, that, surprisingly, folks that pay attention to this stuff like us, this is sort of obvious, I think. But I think a lot of communities and states and are sort of belatedly realizing that most of the BEAD funding is designed to go to rural areas. And so, just to pause there for a minute, it's worth celebrating that rural connectivity challenges, in terms of, building the infrastructure to provide broadband service to rural communities, I think will be mostly met. I think that's the expectation. And I think it's a solid one. And that's good news. That's worth celebrating. But there are still more people without access to broadband living in urban areas than and in suburban areas than in rural America. And so urban areas who are kind of clamoring for more choice among ISPs, more, better, more reliable service, competitive pricing, really aren't going to probably see much in terms of BEAD dollars going to those communities. And so that will be something to really look at moving forward. And I think, communities will have to be very creative and hopefully work closely with the incumbents to address gaps. Some states are, setting up gap networks programs, like the state that I live in Massachusetts, to try to, address some more targeted approaches for example, in affordable housing complexes, multi-dwelling units and such. I think that, looking forward, I think that I'm not going out too far on a limb to say that the big ISPs will probably hoover up the lion's share of the BEAD funds. It's looking that way, and they're really making a full court press for that in various ways. And, what I think concerns me, I'll speak for myself, but I think it's shared among our team over at ILSR, is that what the Biden administration labels the Internet for All initiative, it will probably end up being more like the Internet for Some initiative, which I wrote about in a piece that was recently published in the American Prospect. But BEAD, I think it's also important to remember that, isn't the be all to end all. I mean, it's certainly, the center of the broadband universe at the moment, but there are communities who are building networks without BEAD funding. There's the municipal bond market, there's public-private partnerships. So there's a lot of creative approaches that are being looked at by communities across the country, outside of BEAD, as it were. Obviously rescue plan dollars are much more flexible in terms of what you can spend that on as it relates to broadband. Ted, brought up the FCC digital discrimination rules, which was a, historic and fascinating step that the FCC adopted these rules. The big debate there was whether or not initially the FCC was going to settle on disparate impact, meaning, it didn't really matter. It doesn't really matter so much the intent, but the impact in terms of, offering, say, worse service and fewer options in historically marginalized communities as being, not acceptable anymore. However, the kicker really, though, is that the fines can only be imposed if the service and pricing discrepancies are, and I'm quoting here, not justified by genuine issues of technical or economic feasibility. Now, I would be surprised, and I think many people would be surprised, if the agency really penalized ISPs for digital discrimination, especially after kind of, the industry sort of army of lawyers and technical advisors insist that some of their subscribers who, happen to just be mostly Black and brown communities get worse service and fewer options because of genuine issues of technical or economic feasibility. One of our colleagues, Carl Bodie, wrote a story for The Verge, and there was something interesting in it. He spoke to Adria Tinnen, who's with the Utility Reform Network, and she made an interesting point, which is that these networks are being built on top of infrastructure that was historically determined by redlining. So it's not so much that ISPs are necessarily sort of engaging in digital discrimination, but are sort of building on top of structures where that redlining, as it were, had already happened. And then finally, of course, ACP is big on people's minds. The Affordable Connectivity Program, I think, is an extremely valuable and important program to get folks immediately online. We see it as sort of a Band-Aid solution because it doesn't really address the question of why internet service is so expensive in the first place, but it is a very, very important program. Right now, it seems like a potential disaster. You mentioned at the beginning of the program, the fund is running out, something that we've been tracking. According to our, ACP dashboard, the fund will run out sometime in probably April. There's been, different fits and starts on Capitol Hill as to try to address that. Most recently is the ACP Extension Act, asking for $7 billion, which will basically extend the program. It's a straight appropriations request, would extend the program to the end of 2024. But if the ACP program goes away, it's a big, big deal, not only for users, but I think also particularly for business models in rural America and in tribal areas, where if you've got a significant segment of a market who relies on the ACP, it has profound implications for the financial sustainability of networks in some of these areas. So those are the kind of things that are sort of front and center on my mind, and things that we'll be looking at closely moving forward into 2024.
Well, wonderful. Thank you, Sean. Let's turn it right over to Lynn Stanton to close us out on your thoughts on this topic.
Thank you. Some of the big stories that kept recurring, developing, repeating that I was focusing on last year, I think are going to continue on into the next year, such as the ACP running out of funding, which others have mentioned, the RIP and Replace program, also known as Secure and Trusted Communications Networks reimbursement program, does not have enough funding to cover all of the eligible expenses that telecom carriers are running into. And in pulling out equipment that is deemed to be a national security risk and replacing it with equipment that's not a national security risk, the Biden administration asked for supplemental funding for both of those last fall and hasn't gotten it yet. As Sean just mentioned, by the second quarter, I think we're looking for ACP, Affordable Connectivity Program, to run out of funding. So it will be interesting to see how that works out. There's been, despite Republican support for the program initially, as the requests have come in for more funding, there's been a lot of concern there about how many ACP subscribers were not subscribers to broadband before the ACP program. There's a feeling that if the people that already had broadband but were economically eligible for the ACP have signed up, that's being viewed by some Republicans as an evidence of a failure of the program to be fiscally responsible. There's a lot of big issues that, as was mentioned, with the addition of Ana Gomez to the FCC, and now a 3-2 Democrat majority on the commission, that have been the chairwoman Rosenworcel has been enabled to push forward, or push through the proposal on net neutrality and Title II reclassification of broadband services, the digital discrimination rules that were adopted, allowing the E-rate program to pay for Wi-Fi on school buses is going forward with this 3-2, allowing libraries and schools to pay for hotspots that they would then lend out to students or to families, library customers, like whatever you call a person who has a library card. These were all things that were allowed to proceed because they now have a 3-2 majority. And I think all of those could possibly be facing legal challenges as things go forward. There's challenges to Texas and Florida state laws that address content moderation, and those, of course, will continue the litigation over those. There's also a case from Missouri and Louisiana, I believe, and a number of individuals who challenged ways in which various Biden administration agencies have interacted with social media platforms in trying to suggest that some content is not appropriate, to push other content, and that's before the Supreme Court. So I think I'm running out of my 5 minutes here. And of course, the BEAD awards that the NTIA just recently announced that everybody got in there, all the states and territories got their proposals in for NTIA to review on time. And as Sean mentioned, Louisiana's already had it approved. NTIA is working on approving the others. So Louisiana, obviously, most likely first, and other states and territories will follow. In beginning to that allows the states to get the money, which then in turn they will be giving to subcontractors that will actually do the deployment work for the. And most of the money is going to go for deployment. There's allowances for other uses of it, but that's kind of the first tier of purposes for the money. So that we'll be seeing processes to competitively look at requests from subcontractors for the money and to allot those as we go through the year. Drew?
Thank you. So we've got a huge amount of questions, which is very exciting. I'm going to start with a question by Larry Strickling, the former head of the NTIA, National Telecommunications Information Administration. And he's highlighting work by Carol Maddie. He says, Carol Maddie wrote an important blog a couple weeks ago about the challenge states face to meet the requirements of connecting unserved locations before BEAD money can be spent to upgrade underserved locations. Are states taking this seriously, or is it a ticking time bomb that may impede the ability of states to realize the promise of the program? And Larry, I'm not sure if that's the same blog post that Carol wrote about RDOF and RDOF funds. Perhaps not, but Carol's been writing a lot of good stuff, and I'm going to link in the point about what about RDOF awards that are likely to be defaulted, right? Because that's an issue that they can't get on the map because they're on someone else's map for RDOF funds, but are not likely to be implemented. So let's ask our panel what you think about this point that Larry has made. He's clarified it's a different blog post, but the one about states not meeting their requirement to connect unserved before BEAD monies. Who wants to tackle that?
Well, certainly. Go ahead.
No, I'm sorry, Lynn. You started.
I was just going to say it's certainly a concern, and the mapping issue is a concern because there's been a lot of requests by RDOF winners to get rid of either all or some of their obligations to build out there. There's been a lot of concern about how they were bidding under very different circumstances, that prices have just gone up, enormously between just the regular inflation and all the supply chain issues, and that they just couldn't have been aware of it. Sean?
No, all I was going to say is, as it relates to BEAD, I mean, it's a great question. It's something that we kind of looked at a little bit, or at least I was when I was looking over the various, state BEAD proposals. Some states, explicitly say in their plans that we expect to be able to serve all, unserved and underserved locations within the state with their BEAD allocations, and then other states like Maine, for example, are pretty candid in saying no, it's not going to be enough. As it relates to, the law requires that, the money first be spent on unserved areas. Although there is a question of equity, I think, because underserved areas, particularly, I think, in non-rural communities, theoretically, BEAD dollars can go to that, but there's been a number of states who, in their plans, are essentially saying, we're focusing on unserved, and if there's anything left over, we'll kind of get to the underserved piece. And so again, my big concern is for the substantial number of folks who, for various reasons, do not have broadband access in non-rural communities. And at the end of this process, this, what's been labeled internet for all, how much that will turn out to be either a marketing slogan or a reality. And I, without trying to be too cynical, think we're on a trajectory of it being more like internet for some, mostly rural communities. And folks that are clamoring for competition and competitive pricing and more ISPs, it's going to be a real challenge. If you're in a market that is, where you essentially have one choice, I don't know that that's going to drastically change anytime soon.
So Mike Dunn asks this question, as industry journalists, what are your opinions about how nearly every publication overstate what's happening regarding funding awards? For example, when NTA approves Louisiana's BEAD plans, every headline was Louisiana unlocks 1.3 billion in BEAD funding. So that's fair criticism, right? And just to drill a little more into Mike's question, he's saying that, obviously there's many steps in this process. There's only 20% of the awards, and many people think that's a lot more money. So what can journalists do to give more context and background? Who wants to tackle that one?
I'll start. I mean, it's important for us to not be spun by the headlines, right? And to ask like the deeper questions. And I only partially, I'm in the way we set up our beats, I'm really not the primary reporter on BEAD, but a couple of the issues I've been tracking, one is the extent to which wireless is going to play a role, because one of the fastest areas of wireless of broadband has been fixed wireless access, right? I mean, it's a big, that could have been one of the 12 days of broadband almost, because fixed wireless access was every call that, every financial call, there was a lot of talk about FWA over the last year. But one of the issues that I'm hearing more about is the wireless ISPs had been very focused on trying to get rules that made it possible for them to compete in BEAD. But I think now they're starting to have concerns about overbuilding. They fill gaps out there in rural America and in suburban America too, I think, in areas where the bigger carriers traditionally haven't wanted to serve. I'm sorry, I've got a cat going crazy in the background.
We like cats. Cats are great.
Yeah. The dogs will start barking soon, but one of their big focuses right now is they're starting to ask questions about to what extent is there just going to be overbuilding in the areas that they're already serving. So there's a lot of fascinating questions out there, and I think as journalists we have to keep asking those questions and not just take things at their face value.
True. I was just going to make a point about overbuilding, and that is a lot of terrestrial broadband providers are very concerned about BEAD money overbuilding their broadband infrastructure. I like to make the point that the BEAD program is a government-funded overbuild of Starlink and Project Kuiper, but you don't hear them complaining about it too much.
Well, now by overbuilding, don't you mean competitive?
I was just going to bring that up. Every time, it's one of my pet peeves. We use this term overbuilding. It's an engineering concept that is used by everyone in broadband. But for regular people, the word overbuilding means competition, which is exactly what people are clamoring for.
So Mike Dunn, though, asked another great question, which is, NTA has taken flack for preferring fiber in the BEAD notice of funding opportunity. Why should incumbent ILECs be considered the best stewards of BEAD funding when they've stumbled in rural areas? And I would kind of comment that over the last 6 months of the year, we have heard more and more talk about wireless and even satellite, because there is a kind of a nervousness, will we be able to meet 100% of our state's unserved numbers with fiber builds? So I'd like everyone's comment on this. Is it appropriate or not appropriate to be favoring fiber?
Well, I'll just jump in by saying, circling back to what Larry Strickling was mentioning. Carol Maddie had a blog, might have been on Medium, and I'm not sure if it's the same one that Larry Strickling's talking about, where she made the point that, look, fiber is too expensive to go everywhere in the country with BEAD funding. Let's get over it and let's start talking about alternative technologies such as FWA. And one point that I'd like to make is in Canada has embraced a rebate program for Starlink to get broadband to the truly desperately unserved. Overnight, they're closing the digital divide for thousands of people overnight. I am just surprised that, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm not aware of any state that has used federal broadband money received to date to, take out a Sharpie, especially in big sky country, and draw a big circle on the map and say, we know these people are never going to get fiber, or they're not going to see it for 3 or 4 years. Why don't we give them an opportunity to get Starlink and pay for the equipment? And in Canada, in Quebec, they don't only pay for the equipment, they pay for the service for the first 3 years. So yeah. You get the sense from Washington, D.C. that the digital divide is a 911 situation. And when you look at the complete refusal to think about Starlink as an immediate option, it's really kind of surprising to me.
Yeah, I mean, you raise a good point. I mean, I think, obviously there's something to be said for sort of a mix of technologies to solve this issue, and certainly within the confines of BEAD, this whole notion of extreme high cost locations. If you look at the BEAD plans, there's a number of states that explicitly say that while we favor fiber projects and fiber build outs, there will be communities and instances where that is not economically feasible, and therefore other technologies will be considered. And I think that is wise. On the other hand, there's a good reason, and I think we all know what it is as to why you make the case for, if you're going to invest limited dollars, you want to invest, just like when you build a bridge or a road, you're not building for 5 years or 10 years and then be right back at the same place you were in 5 to 10 years. You're building for connectivity and for networks that have, generational longevity. And fiber, connectivity certainly is the gold standard as it relates to internet service. So there's a good reason, I think, and communities and states will have to ask themselves some hard questions about trade-offs and what have you. And so but certainly NTIA and the federal government did put its thumb on the scale in favor of funding fiber build-outs.
Sean, Ron Suarez has written the most upvoted comment so far. He says, who thinks that funding community-owned internet networks is better for addressing the digital divide rather than giving BEAD dollars to incumbent ISPs? Could you just address that and give your take on what you think these other journalists believe too, right? Is that like, are people allowed to have that view that it's better to have local control for internet networks, Sean?
Oh man, I love this question, and it's right in our alley. And of course, full disclosure, it is a preferred model of ours. We certainly don't make the case that every community ought to be building municipal broadband systems. But under that alternative, I think it's very attractive. I mean, it appeals to all of the things in which people are actually struggling with on the ground. All over the state of Massachusetts, for example, there's dozens and dozens of communities who have grown weary of being in a chokehold of a monopoly ISP, the poor service, the unreliable connectivity, and the extremely high costs that are being extracted from these communities, and see this infrastructure as being on par with roads or water systems and say, why don't we build it ourselves? We've got local say, we've got local accountability, and we have different motives. There's a ubiquitous aspect, and we're not sort of just cherry picking the most affluent areas and making sure we serve those areas. And so
let's hear from Ted, Howard, and Lynn on this point. I'd love their thoughts. Seriously, serious question.
Well, I don't usually go around giving opinions about what the policy should be, but on the face of it, I don't understand why the ownership structure of an entity should be the determining factor in whether they're considered to be the best entity to go forward. They ought to be compared on the basis of their ability to do the job, their financial and technological wherewithal, not based on whether the people who they're going to serve are their owners or ultimately retirement funds, that invest in the stock market are their owners.
Right. No, fair. I mean, it's a fair point. It's a fair
point.
I
wasn't really if I came across that I was disagreeing with, well, wasn't except maybe you're thinking that maybe I'm not quite clear. Is it your position that on the basis of it, the deferment should go to the publicly owned? Because I'm just saying let them all compete equally.
and I'm not saying that one should be favored over the other so much as that I'm saying that certainly the option should be there for communities. And I think a lot of communities are realizing that, look, continuing to give subsidies as we've done for decades to the big incumbents, and we still have this massive digital divide, just simply doesn't work. And primarily because of issues around monopoly concentration, but also, the incentives are different.
Howard or Ted, do you want to weigh in or not?
Well, I guess the safe thing to say is what Lynn just said made sense to me, and I've managed to survive and come daily for 20 years now by not having a lot of opinions. So I will say that as well.
I think that government-owned networks can be problematic. And last week, I wrote a story about a city in Michigan called Norway, Michigan, on the Upper Peninsula in the Iron Range, and they're in the process of selling their municipally owned broadband network to Charter for $5 million.
Okay. We have a question from Jim Mercante. Any opinions on the internet and corresponding infrastructure being designated a public utility, and as such come under jurisdiction of public utilities commissions under the United States? So I don't know if this is a net neutrality question in disguise, but I'd love thoughts and reactions from Jim's question about what does it mean to designate internet as a public utility?
I'm not sure, since it's Jim's question. Maybe he could say what it means, because as far as I know, no one has proposed to designate them at, in those literal terms, no one has proposed to designate them a public utility. So not quite sure what he's getting at.
I think his question is getting at some of the stuff that, we were just talking about, which is that there is a wide, I don't know how to quantify it, but a wide sense that internet has become on par with electricity and water service, and therefore should be treated as such, but it's not. Mm-hmm. And so there is this notion that people have as to ways in which we get there. And that raises a lot of hairy political questions and et cetera, but and about public versus private sector and what have you. But certainly there is, I think, since the pandemic, a extremely widespread view that internet is now an essential service, as is electricity, and therefore should be treated as such, which is why many communities are building the infrastructure. Whether they operate as a retail service provider is a whole separate question. I mean, there's open access networks, there's all kinds of approaches to this, but the infrastructure itself, people are increasingly seeing as similar to roads. And so to say, government shouldn't be in that business is, for a lot of people, like saying we shouldn't have government-owned roads. You
Well,
know,
on a related point, Joshua Richter on LinkedIn has an interesting counterpoint. In our community, a municipal broadband system exists, yet our city administrators are presently impeding another service provider from offering their services within our municipality. And he's talking about the municipality's limited experience in delivering these services, resulting in a subpar performance. Well, I mean, so that's one kind of, alternative case. I mean, I don't hear as many of those. I mean, maybe I hang out too much with Sean and others at ILSR, but I mean, from my experience, municipalities are exceptionally good performers in their broadband, but I'm sure there are stories where they aren't, right? And
well,
so
of course. I mean, but look, restaurants fail all the time, but nobody makes the argument that because, 3 or 4 restaurants close, that the very idea of restaurants is a bad idea. There's going to be bad public works projects. There's going to be mismanagement. There's going to be the big digs, if you will. Oh man, people in my home state are probably going to kill me for that saying that, but there's going to be big digs type of situations as it relates to these kind of things. I mean, that's the nature of, the human condition and some of these projects. But certainly, by and large, there are certainly failures. There are certainly bad municipal projects, et cetera. But there are a ton of wonderful municipal projects. And you see every year PC Mag puts out their fastest ISPs in the nation, some of the most popular ones. Obviously EPB is probably the golden child of municipal networks, but there's a bunch of great municipal networks in the Front Range area of Colorado. Our team was just out visiting Longmont, Fort Collins, Loveland.
Right. Drew,
to Ted's point about this, was it Norway, Michigan?
Right.
Sale of a municipal, every week, practically every day, I get press releases about one telecom or cable system being sold to a different telecom or cable system. And I don't see anyone pointing that out as evidence of some kind of failure of private telecom or cable broadband providers because some of them get sold. So I'm not quite sure the point of Ted's.
So
anyway, Drew, I was just going to make the point that since the dawn of the internet, which I happen to remember,
you are old, Dad.
the light touch regulation has worked remarkably well, and I think it's impossible to deny it. And the one outlier over the past 25 years was the Wheeler FCC, and I don't quite understand why so many people are agitating to basically strangle broadband ISPs with unnecessary regulation.
Well, let's actually use that as a segue. We've got a lot of questions still. Thank you everyone for bringing these questions. I think they can be mostly encapsulated in 3 core topics that I want to get everyone's take on: net neutrality, digital discrimination, and the Affordable Connectivity Program. Okay, all big issues. All, by the way, featured in our 12 Days of Broadband. What do each of you think about let's just take the litigation, at least in terms of net neutrality and digital discrimination, but also feel free to talk about the others. Howard, you go. We haven't heard as much from you.
Yeah. One of the things I think that's been interesting about net neutrality is that for those of us who covered it multiple times in the past, how relatively quiet it was when the FCC acted the last time. I think to a certain extent, that reflects the fact that the industry is sort of feels that any strict rules will probably be overturned in the courts. But the problem with that is that you have to be somewhat careful in thinking you're going to know for sure what the courts are going to do, right? Because they can be unpredictable. On the other hand, you do have a fairly activist Supreme Court right now in the major questions doctrine. So to me, that's just been interesting. And another thing I've heard from a couple of lawyers lately is that net neutrality was really good for them at the end of the year because they had 2023 wasn't a great year in terms of billing. and they were able to get a lot more billing in, because regardless, it's still it's one of those things that sort of floats out every boat, right? So so maybe net neutrality and the threat of net neutrality is just good for everybody. I don't know. That's one possibility.
Lynn, what do you think about those issues? Net neutrality, digital discrimination, ACP?
Someone, I think it was Ted, mentioned the major questions doctrine, and I think that's going to be very interesting to see how that plays out with respect to the digital discrimination and net neutrality Title II items, assuming that one gets adopted. On the one hand, it certainly gives a lot more range for the lower courts and eventually the Supreme Court to overturn, particularly the Title II, despite the was it 2004 the Brand X case, in which the Supreme Court said the FCC had the leverage to decide, or the authority decide which it was, and information service or telecommunication service, but of course this court has also shown that it's not totally averse to overturning its previous rulings. So,
well, no, I mean, yeah, exactly. I mean, I have never quite understood.
Although I would say that I think in a lot of the areas where it has done that, you can see a stronger political, ideological even role in the particular issues that occurred in than perhaps in net neutrality, where everyone says they are in favor of net neutrality. It's just the means by which we get it that they argue over. So,
yeah.
Good point. I just wanted to
I've never quite understood why the major, I mean, no one's been able to explain why major questions is a major question. However, if Chevron is reversed, if Chevron deference is reversed, boy, all bets are off, right? I mean, that changes so much in this landscape as well as many others.
Look, I'm not a lawyer, but just my understanding of it is that in the digital discrimination rulemaking, Congress, as I said, handed the FCC broad language to address digital discrimination. And that probably wouldn't be a problem with the major questions doctrine, because the major questions doctrine says, is this a politically and economically, significant issue, and has Congress authorized the agency to, address it and to write a rule? I don't think the digital discrimination proceeding runs into a major questions problem, because Congress gave the FCC fairly broad and clear instructions on what to do. But with net neutrality, if you've read all those expensive filings that came in on December 14th, you'll see that it's Justice Kavanaugh has already written that net neutrality is a major question, and Congress has not addressed it, and for that reason, the Wheeler FCC net neutrality rules were invalid. And last point I'll make is that the Supreme Court is stacked with justices, 5 or 6, who want to cage the administrative state and stop agencies like the FCC from imposing things like net neutrality when they don't have clear authorization from Congress.
Mm-hmm. Sean, how do you think about these three issues?
I think Ted's right on the mark about it on that last point, as it relates to the Supreme Court. So if I, looking forward, I wouldn't be hanging my hat on the FCC and what they're going to do with net neutrality. I don't expect the new, digital discrimination rules to amount to much. Although, some local communities, I'm sure, are looking to leverage those things. I mean, but overall, the question is, everybody, internet for all, are we going to live in a country that settles for massive numbers of people who don't have internet connectivity? Laying aside questions of how you get there, if we've got massive numbers of folks who cannot access the internet, either because of affordability, infrastructure, reliability, etc., we're creating a class of people that aren't going to be able to fully and meaningfully participate in an internet connected world. That's what's at stake. That's what's at issue, and we need to get to that point if we're going to be serious about that. And one thing that I'm looking for the light bulb to go off in folks' heads as it relates to this question of universal access and as it relates to telehealth. Because I think there are massive healthcare savings that can come from that. There are massive enhancements to life, to quality of life and health. Improving people's health. That you need universal access in order to realize that potential. And so, at the end of the day, we need to get to the internet for all. I'm just not convinced that the current BEAD program and such are going to get us there.
All right, our time's come up. We got more questions than we can answer, but I want to give each of the four of you, in the same order we started, a chance to say one issue that is kind of a surprise issue that you're looking for in 2024. Ted, you go first.
Well, I would say that cable broadband is not a growth story. Fixed wireless has blunted cable broadband growth, and Comcast lost subscribers in the third quarter. Charter is saying it's going to lose broadband subscribers in the fourth quarter, and the cable people are saying that they think that fixed wireless doesn't have the bandwidth to compete strongly for many years, and it's going to be interesting to see if that thesis is correct.
Okay, Howard, your surprise.
Agree. There are questions about fixed wireless and its overall resilience. I don't expect any big surprises in 2024. I think the major question now for me is to what extent you're going to see the FCC tying up a lot of loose ends over the next year, and what role the new Commissioner Ana Gomez plays in all these decisions. Those are two big questions right now that I think are sort of this FCC, if anything, has been a little unpredictable. So those are I think two of the big questions right now.
All right, John, and then Lynn.
No real big surprises. One big change that we're seeing, though, and we'll see more of it, is just as it relates to some of the stuff that you were talking about the cable subscriptions, and it's not a growth area. Fixed wireless is. That's certainly the case. We're seeing some very vicious public campaigns against any alternative form of network building, meaning whether any form of community networks. Prior, in years past, it was mostly aimed at policymakers and politicians to discourage them from investing in, say, municipal networks, et cetera. But now you're starting to see all over the country these AstroTurf campaigns come up, and I think it's because the cable industry, largely big cable, considers this development to be an existential threat to their bottom line, and are funding a lot of these campaigns to dissuade people from doing anything other than giving tax dollars to the big incumbents and to rely on them to solve it all.
Interesting point. All right, Lynn, you get the last word for us.
I'd say there's going to be some big sleeper issue we've all completely forgotten about that will somehow rise from the dead now that the FCC has this 3-5 majority.
Well, that will have to be the last word. Thank you to all for joining us, and we'll see you next Wednesday from Las Vegas at 12 noon Eastern time. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Happy New Year.